Picture this. A small-town baker with a heart full of dreams meets a world-traveling photographer who's never stayed in one place for more than a month. At first glance, they couldn't be more different. She found joy in the quiet simplicity of her daily routine, while he thrived on adventure and spontaneity. When their worlds collided one rainy afternoon, sparks flew, but not the kind you'd expect. Their first conversation turned into a heated debate about everything from music to the meaning of success. Friends rolled their eyes, and whispers around town grew louder. They're too different. It'll never work. And honestly, even they had their doubts. But something kept pulling them back to each other, time after time. What started as unlikely became undeniable. They faced judgment, misunderstandings, and moments where walking away felt easier than holding on. But their journey was far from ordinary. It was filled with twists, turns, and a few miracles along the way. And here's the thing: those who once doubted them now look at their love with envy, wondering how it all came together so perfectly. So, what changed? What's the secret to their happiness? Let me take you back to where it all began. The rain that brought them together wasn't just an accident. It was a foreshadowing of the storm that would come to define their relationship. She had been closing up the bakery for the night when he burst through the door, drenched, frustrated, and looking for shelter. His camera bag was soaked, and she could see the panic in his eyes as he tried to save his gear. Without hesitation, she offered him a towel and a cup of tea. He hesitated, but then accepted, sitting awkwardly at one of the small tables, clearly out of place in the cozy, flower-dusted shop. Their first conversation was awkward, peppered with misunderstandings and subtle clashes. He scoffed at the idea of staying in one place for years, while she couldn't understand how anyone could live without roots. But something in their differences intrigued them both. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about baking, how she described kneading dough as a form of therapy. She was fascinated by his stories of traveling through remote villages, capturing moments most people never got to see. Their worlds were so far apart that it almost felt magnetic. But the real tension began when they started spending more time together. It wasn't planned. It just happened. He would show up at the bakery early in the morning, claiming he needed good coffee to start his day. She would pretend she didn't notice him watching her as she worked. They argued constantly about books, movies, even the best way to brew coffee. Yet, somehow, those arguments always ended in laughter, as if the conflict itself was a bridge they were building. When he told her he'd be leaving in a month for his next trip, something shifted. She didn't say anything, but her usual cheerful demeanor dimmed slightly. He noticed. "You don't think I can settle down, do you?" he asked one evening as they sat on the bench outside her shop, the smell of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. She hesitated, then admitted, "I don't think you want to." It wasn't meant as an accusation, but it felt like one. He didn't respond, and for the first time, their silence wasn't comfortable. As the days ticked by, the small-town whispers grew louder. Regulars at the bakery would glance at them and smirk. "She's wasting her time," someone said loud enough for her to hear one morning. "He'll leave like he always does," another added. She tried to ignore them, but their words stuck. He, on the other hand, seemed oblivious, or maybe he just didn't care. Either way, it created a rift neither of them knew how to bridge. Then came the night of the town's annual harvest festival. It was the kind of event she loved: warm lights strung across the square, live music, and families gathered to celebrate. He hated crowds, but showed up anyway, standing awkwardly at the edge of the festivities. When she spotted him, her heart did that thing she hated, fluttering in a way that made her feel vulnerable. She tried to ignore it, busying herself with serving pies and pastries from her booth. But he didn't let her avoid him for long. "I don't get it," he said, standing in front of her booth. "What's so special about staying in one place?" She looked at him, exasperated. What's so special about running away from everything? The words came out sharper than she intended, and his expression darkened. I'm not running away, he said quietly. That night, their argument spilled into the streets as they walked home. She accused him of being afraid of commitment, of not wanting to let anyone in. He fired back, saying she was too afraid to step out of her comfort zone, too scared to dream beyond her little bakery. They both said things they didn't mean, words that hung in the air long after they parted ways. For days, they didn't speak. He focused on preparing for his trip, burying himself in work, while she threw herself into the bakery, trying to forget how much she missed him. The town, of course, noticed. Told you it wouldn't last, someone said, and she bit her tongue to keep from snapping back. But then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the bakery, addressed to her in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a photograph one he had taken of her without her knowing. It captured her mid-laugh, flour on her face, sunlight streaming through the bakery window. On the back, he had written, "You were wrong. I'm not running. But maybe you're right about one thing. I've never had a reason to stay." Until now. She stared at the photo for what felt like hours, her emotions a tangled mess. Was this his way of apologizing? Or was it just another one of his fleeting gestures, something that would vanish as quickly as he would? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and for the first time, she didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, he was grappling with his own doubts. His whole life had been about movement, about capturing moments and moving on before they could fade. But now, for the first time, he was questioning whether leaving was the right choice. The thought of walking away from her, from the life they could build together, felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. The day of his departure loomed closer, and the tension between them grew unbearable. They avoided each other, both afraid of what the other might say, or worse, what they might not say. The town buzzed with speculation, everyone waiting to see how their story would end. But this story isn't over. Not yet. Because as the clock ticks down, both of them are faced with a choice: hold on to the lives they've always known, or take a leap of faith into the unknown. The question is, will they take that leap together, or will fear and pride tear them apart for good? The morning of his departure arrived, cloaked in a quiet heaviness that neither of them could ignore. She opened the bakery as usual, but her movements felt mechanical, her mind elsewhere. Every chime of the bell over the door made her heart race. Though she wasn't sure whether she wanted it to be him walking in or not, she told herself she was fine, that it was better this way. After all, they had always been on borrowed time. But the ache in her chest betrayed her resolve. Across town, he sat in his small rented apartment, surrounded by packed bags and a plane ticket he couldn't bring himself to look at. He thought about how easy it would be to leave, to slip out of her life as quietly as he had entered it. It was what he'd always done, wasn't it? Keep moving, never stay long enough to feel the weight of attachment. But this time was different. She had made it different. And as much as he tried to convince himself that leaving was the right thing to do, the thought of her standing in the bakery, waiting for a goodbye he might never give, gnawed at him. He found himself walking toward the bakery without realizing it, his feet moving faster the closer he got. The small bell above the door rang as he stepped inside, and there she was, kneading dough with her back turned to him. For a moment, he just watched her, taking in the sight he knew he would carry with him no matter where he went. When she finally turned and saw him, her hands froze mid-motion, flour dusting her fingers. "You're still here," she said softly, the words a mix of relief and hesitation. He nodded, stepping closer. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." The way he said it, so quiet and uncertain, made her heart twist. "Goodbye," she echoed, the word heavy with everything they weren't saying. She turned back to the dough, her movements slow and deliberate. Well, I guess this is it then. Her calmness was a mask, and he could see right through it. Is that all you have to say? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. She paused, her hands stilling. What else is there to say? You've made up your mind, haven't you? He didn't respond, and the silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken words and lingering tension. Finally, he spoke. What if I haven't? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something certainty, maybe, or courage. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. I'm saying I don't know how to leave you, he admitted, his voice raw and unguarded. I've been trying to convince myself that I can, but the truth is, I don't want to. Her breath caught, her hands trembling slightly. Then don't, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was simple, almost too simple, but it was all she had. Stay. The word hung in the air, a fragile plea that felt as vulnerable as it was powerful. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her flour-dusted hand in his. You make it sound so easy, he said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe it is, she replied, her voice steady now. Maybe it's not about running or staying. Maybe it's just about choosing. And so, he chose. He didn't board the plane that day or the next. Instead, he stayed. At first, it wasn't easy. He was used to constant motion, to the thrill of the unfamiliar. Settling into a routine felt foreign, even stifling at times. But every morning when he walked into the bakery and saw her smile, he was reminded of why he had stayed. It wasn't about giving up his freedom or sacrificing his dreams. It was about building something new, something worth staying for. They didn't have all the answers, and they knew there would be challenges ahead. His restless spirit didn't vanish overnight, and she sometimes struggled with the fear that he might still leave someday. But they faced those fears together, learning to trust not just each other but the life they were creating. The town's whispers faded over time, replaced by nods of approval and quiet admiration. The same people who had doubted their relationship now came to the bakery just to catch a glimpse of them, the unlikely couple who had proved everyone wrong. They didn't care much about the town's opinions anymore, though. Their focus was on each other and the future they were building one day. One argument, one laugh at a time. One evening, as they sat on the bench outside the bakery, watching the sun set over the town, he turned to her and said, You know, I used to think staying in one place meant giving up on adventure. But you've shown me it's the opposite. What we have, it's the greatest adventure of all. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. And you've shown me that dreaming big doesn't mean losing what matters most. It just means sharing the dream with someone who believes in it as much as you do. Their story wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But that was the beauty of it. It was real, messy, and full of contradictions just like them. And in the end, that's what made it worth everything they had to fight for. Because sometimes the love stories that seem impossible are the ones that prove to be the most extraordinary.